Okay. So this is topic 8. At this point, we do only have 3 other topics after this, 19 and 11. We do have class, I think, 4 more Thursdays, but that'll work out well because then we can do 9, 10, and 11. I think we have, how many more Thursdays do we have left? Let's go look on the calendar. I think we have enough. Is it 3 or 4 that we have?
Last day of class is 29th?
30, yeah, 29th or 30th?
Yeah, 4 more Thursdays.
Exactly, okay.
9 including today.
Excellent, perfect, okay. Then I am just...
Oh, wait. There's Thanksgiving on 22nd, right?
There is, so 3.
3.
Okay, that's fine. Because I don't know if we'll actually do the last one, so it's okay. Okay. So now I want to do a little bit of a segue here. So now you have an idea of what the solar growth model looks like. Now I want to understand something that's fundamental to the macroeconomics field, which is why are there fluctuations over time? Why is there a business cycle, essentially? Now, this is a really, this is a pretty interesting topic that people devote their entire careers to trying to understand. The National Bureau of Economic Research, which emerged in the 1920s, the big thing, so this is before Keynes, the big thing was trying to understand why does an economy go through these boom and bust cycles, right? Where the economy does really well, then does really bad, then it does really, right, and then slowly grows really well, and then does bad. Why does it always have to be that way? Why couldn't it just always grow? Or why in some countries does it seem to always suck? So, and some of you have maybe seen this before, and I don't want to spend too much time on this. So the National Bureau of Economic Research only emerges in the 1920s. So what they basically had to do is, after they did this, they had to go back over time. Let me go to share this just so that we can all see this. Okay, so the idea is that if we look at all of these, so the official job of the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is not a government organization, it's just a non-for-profit, there's a lot of really good economists, is that they look over time and they see what did they think business cycles were at. So a business cycle follows, which you may have seen in Principles of Macro. I generally talk about it for a brief little bit, but it's this idea that over time, let's say there's a 4% GDP growth rate, is that the economy doesn't grow at the strict 4% over time, that the average is 4% over time. And that there's this idea that there are peaks, there are troughs, exactly. There are recessions that bring us down to that bottom point, and there are expansions that lead us to that peak. Obviously, there's a lot of money to be made if you knew exactly where the peaks, troughs were, or you could anticipate when the expansion or the recession was going to be. So what the NBER is in charge of is the official dating committee for determining where we are at. Oh, that's why. Isn't this thing as a thing form is plugged in Um, that don't worry about which is. What was this? What you can see here is that you've got number of months from peak to trough, previous trough to this peak, trough to trough, peak to peak. Let's just focus on peak to peak. Because peak to peak is going to say, how many months was it, how many months did it take to go from one peak to another, okay? So, how quickly or short do things go? Now, what you're seeing here is that for a pretty long time, now this one right here is our post-Civil War expansion, right? By this point, the Transcontinental Railroad is finished and all those other kinds of big projects, right? The West is expanding. So let's just discount this period right here. But if we look at this, that's pretty, right? Basically, every 3 years, you're going through an entire cycle of recession, expansion, peak, recession, trough, right? I mean, every 3 years, you're completing a cycle. That's incredibly short. And certainly in your lifetimes, you've had a very boring life because you've basically lived through, for your almost your entire life, you've lived through 2 cycles, and that's it. Even my life isn't that much more exciting because, let's say I went through 1, 2, 3, 4. I've only had 4 cycles in my life. And I'm 41. So even my life's not that exciting. So even, right, so here we're looking at 1920s, still in the same thing. But then look at the fundamental shift that then happens, right? So most people focus on this as the Great Depression, 1929 to 1933. But actually by 1933, things were actually getting better, which is noted by the fact that, right, that's actually 1 cycle, it's right there. But then in 1933, with the election of FDR and the collapse of the banking system, the economy took a downturn, much more severe. And then really the only thing that really saves the economy is having to fight the Nazis and the Japanese. That's really the thing that gets us out of the Great Recession. But then you see a shift here where the cycles are getting incredibly longer, largely because of expanded military and government spending. Then you have this point where we're not exactly employing macroeconomics. It's a little bit longer than it used to be, but it's not fundamentally different. Here's the kind of the classic expansion as we're fighting communists in Vietnam. But now, looking at the modern economy that I certainly was born into, as I was saying, I remember this recession because my father got laid off. It was the only time he ever got laid off was this recession. This was the one right after the first time we fought the Iraqis. This was the explosion of the dot-com boom, and this was the most recent one. So that's why I'm saying I've lived through 4. And I can remember because I was just going through in my head, not even looking at this. Dude, I've had a pretty easy life because for the most part, right, these cycles have been incredibly long for most of my modern memory. And the only reason why, again, I can remember the very first recession was I remember my dad being laid off. And that was the only thing I really remember about it. So what is fundamentally different about today? I mean, you can see this also too here when you do the averages, that if we look at the entire time of measured history, 56.4, but then if we break it into these early or somewhat modern economy, what we call the interwar period between World War I and World War II and post-World War II. Something is fundamentally different about the post-World War II economy where the cycles have been longer. But even if we just did it even a little bit more differently, something is very different about the economy that we see today. and that we've experienced all in our lifetimes. So what is it? And how do we know it when we see it? Let's see what that is.
Do you know what that is now? Or?
No. No, we're... I'll talk about some of the theories of what we think is different, but a lot of it is just self-serving theories of economists just think that we're better at managing the entire economy now. That's just kind of like a painter saying your house looks better because I painted it rather than, right? So it's self-serving why they're saying what they're saying. We'll talk a little bit about it. But basically, the thing we need to look at to try to better understand the business cycle is we need to have a better understanding of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So these terms you won't have seen before. You obviously looked at the business cycle a little bit in principles, and you obviously know demand and supply, but you just know individual consumer demanding things, individual producers supplying things. What if we wanted to look now at aggregate demand and aggregate supply and how things can change in the economy? Okay. So a normal growing economy grows at 3 to 3.5% per year. We know that the most volatile component of the GDP is really investment. Investment is changing the most. And more specifically, it's inventories that are driving most of the changes in a modern macroeconomy. The typical way, how do we know that we're in a recession? We know that we're in a recession because people are losing their jobs. So typically we focus on unemployment as our kind of shadow variable of are things bad or not? For instance, right now we would say that things are pretty darn good in Hawaii, and we know that they're good because tourism is at an all-time high, and it's our biggest industry, and consequently, the unemployment rate here is the lowest in the nation, something like 2-something%. Anyone know what state has the highest unemployment rate right now in the U.S.?
Mississippi, West Virginia.
Usually it's those two are right up there, but I think right now the winner of that is Alaska.
Oh, the oil.
Oil, yeah. So oil, since it reached its low now, and it's basically a raw materials dependent economy, the unemployment rate in a state like Alaska, but we would also think North Dakota, which did a lot of frack drilling, but also West Virginia because of coal. Those are places where they're at least not necessarily having a statewide recession, but where we would say that things are not good economically, and that unemployment is higher.
Which place has the lowest unemployment
Hawaii.
in the U.S.?
Yeah, Hawaii has the lowest right now as a state, and I think you would see. Yeah, no, and I think. But now Ian's question makes me actually think: what is that really? Yeah, so we have 2.2%, which is always accurate, 2.2%. Iowa, largely because of soybean, but also they're getting bigger about manufacturing. Yeah, I mean, West Virginia. So I was right, Alaska, 6.5%. District of Columbia, you can't really count it because there's so few people. West Virginia, Mississippi, shouldn't be too many surprises here on the bottom here. But on the other hand, most of these, I mean, does it really make a difference if it's 3.9 versus 4, right? I mean, there's not a lot of differences here. I'm actually a little surprised by the North Dakota that they actually did that well, but yeah. Okay, so, but what we see here is Okun's law, which gives us a way to say that there's an inverse relationship between real GDP and unemployment. Basically, unemployment would have to be higher if real GDP was lower. and vice versa. So they're moving in opposing directions with each other. They're moving in opposing directions with each other.
Mm.
So, what we need to do then is where economists make their money is being able to make predictions. I mean, economists are not worth their weight if they can't make an honest prediction about how things are going to be. So, how would I tell how things are going to be in the future? Just right, like why do we all watch Guy Hoggy, right? Yeah, he's cool. He's a surfing meteorologist, but we also like
Did you
we
see
have
those
to.
memes?
What?
The Guy Hoggy memes?
No, I haven't seen any
You
of
don't,
those.
you don't see those?
No.
It's so funny. Do you watch them? You see it, right?
Yeah, my wife has met him. Had dinner
Like,
with
I'm
him.
not lying this time. The hurricane's coming.
My wife had dinner with him. He sounds like a really cool guy, actually. I think it's like one of the rare times when my wife asks for an autograph.
Like,
Usually she doesn't.
The missile stay coming. I'm not lying.
Fuckers. I'm not lying, you fuckers. Is that what you said for the hurricane? I'm not lying? Did you
No,
say that too?
it's just jokes like
Yeah.
this.
Yeah, today he was talking about the box jellies and how there wasn't a lot of surf today. I did see them do that. So yeah, he's a cool guy, but also, right, when you follow a certain weather person, it would be because he or she makes good predictions. Oh,
When the hurricane came.
yeah. Guy Hoggy. So the best thing to do would be to look at the index of leading economic indicators. These are all collected by the Conference Board, which is not, again, part of the government. Let's just look at what these leading economic indicators suggest here. So let's go to Fred. There's Fred Figglehorn. Who guy? Fred Figglehorn? There you go. So does he stock him for the
Starting, can
for
you
the
share
spot as well?
Fred?
Wait, is that Kristen? I'm guessing it is. Is it? Do we hear? Hey. Are you eating the regular? Is she eating the regular ones too, or no?
Some got them in my drawer if she wants.
How many does he have in his drawer right now?
I don't know, like 10.
Wow, dude.
Yeah, I bought out them.
Is this in your nightstand? Like you roll over at night and you can like open the drawer and
How did you know?
Is it really?
Yeah, it's my nightstand.
Oh my god, my wife would never let me store food next to where I sleep. Yeah.
Usually not for that, but sealed. So.
Yeah. So this is the leading economic indicator index. So it's basically, think of this like in the index term, it's basically a collection of all the statistics that economists like to look at when they're trying to make a prediction of what they think is going to happen in the future. Let me give you some other examples of what economists look at. We look at railroad traffic because a lot of goods are transported by the rail. So we can look at railroad traffic as an indicator. Cardboard box production, right? Because things that are made are usually put in cardboard boxes. So we look at cardboard box production as a way to indicate what we think is going to happen in the future. What are the other ones? Obviously raw materials, right? Because firms buy raw materials and then turn them into, right, finished goods. Check processing, right? Because obviously if you're using, not only are you hiring workers, but most workers are hired by a company called ADP. And if ADP is processing your check, then it probably means that you're a worker and you're going to be working for some period of time. What you see here is that it starts turning down before the actual recession happens. Starts turning down before the actual recession happens. This one, not so much, because this did catch economists by surprise. But again, at least it did start turning down before the recession officially started.
Sorry, can you share your screen?
Oh yeah, sorry. Or maybe I am just trying to sabotage you. Here. All good?
Oh, good. Thanks.
Okay. Yep. So again, what you're seeing here is, again, the downturn's happening right before the recession, downturn happening right before the recession, downturn happening before the recession. But this one is of note because most economists didn't formally predict the recession before it actually happened, and certainly didn't predict the degree of that. But what you're seeing then more recently, and again, this data is taking us out to at least August, there's no predictions of things turning bad anytime soon. You know, again, we could have our debates about whether we think that's actually going to happen, but economists aren't generally. Let's change the date of this.
So it looks like we're due for a recession.
Well, I guess what you would say here. So I'm just focusing now on 2015 forward. You certainly would seem to indicate that the market's getting tired. That the economic expansion has happened for almost too long at this point. And this is a pretty long time. And you see these kinds of fits here. I guess it's really kind of the best way to talk about it. Where, I mean, we're not talking about major differences here, but certainly if we're going from something close to 2 to something close to 1 in about a year and a half time period, or 2.5 year time period, you're certainly seeing some indication that things are getting bad, or are going to be getting bad. Okay, let's go back to this and then share it. So, other things that are used in this, and I just told you a few of them. Things like consumer expectations. This would be University of Michigan consumer sentiment. The size of the money supply, obviously. How many building permits do you have going out, right? That would be a pretty good sign of people building things. New orders, unemployment insurance. So these are the variety of statistics that economists look at to create this leading economic indicator index of what they think is going to happen 6 to 9 months from now. It's a calm before the storm, right? I mean, this is the equivalent of, we are more likely to know a recession is going to happen because, more specifically, University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Survey will probably indicate to us things are going to get bad right before they get bad. Let's actually look and see if that is actually true. I'm hoping it is. So I'm going to go back to Fred, who does everything for us. And I'm going to look at University of Michigan consumer sentiment. Why is it discontinued? It's not discontinued. Or maybe this one's the data anymore. I'm guessing that's it.
Or whenever your election ends.
What is it?
That's right now.
Or is she talking to someone else? You talking to someone else? Or someone talking to her?
I think her mic is constantly on.
That's all right. Who do you think she's talking to? A ghost?
Probably my sister.
Oh, the bully. No. I'm kidding. Let's just look at it this way. Okay, so These would be expectations of consumers about how things are going to go. What's interesting about this is, again, everyone thought that in 2011, 2012, things were going to enter a new recession, and it didn't. And we've been living basically in the wake of that ever since. Because basically, the Federal Reserve had to boost the money supply significantly in 2011, 2012 with quantitative easing on an unlimited basis up until 2016, 2017, to get us out of this almost recession that happened in 2011. But you can see it's real that it almost happened again in 2011. And then kind of take off from there. Okay. Share this.
Is it a bad thing to have just constant growth?
Yeah, it is. It is, because it basically means that the next recession is going to be worse. The longer we go on like this, the worse the next recession will be. Very occasionally, like the 2001 recession, what year were you born?
Like 90s?
Yeah, so, it's not, you don't even probably remember the 2001 recession. The 2001 recession lasted from March of that year to September, maybe October of that year. So it wasn't at all affected by September 11th or any of those things. It was a recession that started in 2001 and lasted less than a year. The recession before that was in 1990 and was also a recession that lasted less than a year. So all that's leading up to a very severe recession that happened in 2007, 2008, because all that we had been doing is minor recession happens, and then people did fought a little garbage can fire with a big fire hose, right? And quashed it before it could fully work itself through the economy. Which means it's so, again, as I kind of indicated before, throughout the 1990s, you see this explosion in loose money that's having to be filtered to Russia, developing countries like South Korea, Thailand, Indonesia. And we keep getting these almost recessions, like the one in 97. You keep getting these almost recessions, like even the one in 2003, where it gets quashed immediately, and it just leads to a very bad recession. So economists do want another recession to happen because the next one's going to be pretty bad. You've seen this before, but basically we now need to separate time into two time periods, long run, short run. How long is the long run? The long run is basically as long as needed for prices to be flexible. That's really the defining feature. We have reached the long run when prices can be renegotiated. We know that in the short run, prices and wages are sticky, either because of contracts that vendors have with the supplying firms, or for instance, my wages are basically locked in for the next 3 years after this. Which means that Ige can do whatever he wants 3 years from now, but until then, I'm basically going to earn the salary I'm earning, right? And 3 years from now, they can renegotiate it. That's why, for instance, during the last recession, professors' wages didn't get adjusted until 2010, even though the recession had already kind of largely ended by then. But that was the first chance that the state had to negotiate my wage again. He didn't ask me what he was going to do, but if he had asked me, what should he do? As an economist, I probably would have said, don't sign a 4-year labor contract, because do you really want to lock in wages for 4 years when you don't know what the next 4 years are going to look like? Politically, it might have been smart, but economically speaking, it doesn't make a lot of sense to keep things sticky for that long. Obviously, we know for some products, there's a lot more stickiness than others. A classic example would be, dude, Costco's been charging $1.50 for a hot dog and soda forever, right?
It's a good deal.
Exactly, it's a good deal, but it probably was a good deal 2 decades ago when they first offered it, right? Whereas what they sell for gas fluctuates pretty much with what oil prices adjust at for the most part. 2 different notions of long run versus short run. or two different, at least, distinctions of how those things are reaching those points. So, in the classical model that we have looked at for the majority of this class so far, we are basically looking at something where things are adjusting, right? That prices are adjusting. So it's basically a long-run model. Which means, going back to this chart that Kristen can't see, so now we can do the really cool stuff, would be, right, we know that it's going to happen, that the economy is going to grow 3 to 4% over time. But the money for an economist is to be made, not in saying this, because it's like a no shit, right? I mean, of course it's going to grow. Yeah, you can take a picture.
I'll send it to her.
Yeah, of course it's going to grow by 4%. I'm not going to get paid a 6-figure salary, right, for saying that, because you don't need an economist, a PhD economist, to say that. What you need a PhD economist to do is to be able to say that we're about to reach this, or that we're going to get to this, or somewhere here, or somewhere here, right? Which means I can't use a classical model to explain the fluctuations. All that the classical model is telling me is the trend line. That doesn't do much for me for planning purposes. That's what this chapter is about, is being able to explain the fluctuations. And the only way you can explain those fluctuations is if I don't have price flexibility. In other words, if I have rigidity to my prices and wages. I'll wait. I mean, so this trip to Japan's over winter break, right? So Leroy will be able to take the vacation with me because he's not going to have to supply things to the vending machines here, right? I mean, right? I mean, presumably, you don't think he's going to want to come, do you? No? Okay.
Yeah, give me more points.
Yeah, I don't know if I want to sit next to him on the plane anyway.
He might tell you about how his work sucks.
Yeah, exactly. I don't need to fly 8 hours to hear that. Okay, so let's be more realistic here. Let's look at, the only thing that's going to be a little different here is we're going to keep it a closed economy. That way we don't have to deal with net exports. But let's look at a model now for the macroeconomy in the short run. Meaning, how do we explain these fluctuations? To do that, we need to have sticky prices, and we need to look at then ways that either the central bank through monetary policy or the government through fiscal policy adjust these things over time. So is everyone clear about where we're going with this?
So
The classical model explains the trend line. What we want to do in this chapter is we want to explain the fluctuations. Fluctuations have sticky prices. The trend line has everything is flexible.
so far we've been only talking about the trend line.
Exactly. Yep.
Now we're going to get into
Now we're actually getting into the detail of why is today's economy different than the economy that existed 3 years ago. All that we've been doing is saying, why is the economy from 1950, for instance, to the 21.8 grown at a 4% average annual rate over that entire 70-year time period, or 68-year time period? It doesn't, although some of the same policies are at use here, you could again imagine if you're paying Scheiding for economic advice, you're not going to pay me that much to tell you what's been happening over the past 68 years. You want to know what's going to happen 1 year from now or 6 months from now, because then you get to know something before everyone else does. Now, I can be wrong, just like Hagi can be wrong, but right, that then makes a difference between why I get paid a lot as an analyst and forecaster or not as much, right? Which would be why sometimes I think it doesn't take a rocket scientist to be a weather forecaster in Hawaii because it's always 80 degrees and sunny, right? I'm sure Hagi would say something different, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to be a right? It would seem like it's harder in the Midwest because, dude, in the Midwest, it's always like tornadoes and storms and other things. Okay. So, the model that we're going to use to talk about the economy in the short run is an aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. And in that aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, we can have stable or fixed, inflexible prices and wages. And we can, in the short run and long run, then talk about the impact that fiscal and monetary policy can have to push us out of a trough or keep us at a peak longer. This model is your Keynesian model, right? So the solo growth model was not Keynesian. This is what made Keynes his name in macroeconomic thought. This is what, I mean, when you think about what you thought of Keynes in principles, is you thought Keynes was cool because it was like, oh yeah, we need government stimulus to replace lost consumer consumption, right? So we think of Keynes as, you know, the guy that tells the government to hire people because other businesses aren't hiring workers, right? Like fiscal stimulus. But Keynes is much more than that. Keynes is the person who gives us this aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, which is what he uses to say that a government should replace lackluster consumption or insufficient investment. And what that model does is it determines two things. It determines the overall price level in the economy and the amount of real GDP. Just like a demand and supply graph tells us two things, price and quantity. Same thing, right? Price level is the same as price. Real GDP is the same as quantity. So it's telling us the exact same information, P and Q. So let's look at what that is. Okay, so we know this equation already, MV equals PQ or PY, doesn't matter which one you use. Then when we assumed the fixed values of the money supply, M, again, money supply, V, velocity, P, the price level, Y being the real GDP. If we assume that the money supply and the velocity of money is constant, then we see that these two are going to be inverse to each other, P and Q, or P and Y. So, right, if one goes up, the other has to go down because it still has to equal M times V. Then, what we see here for our aggregate demand curve is that it's not necessarily as the price level falls, people buy more, which is our way of understanding the demand curve. This is different. What this is saying is that as the price level falls, people's demand for real money balances changes. And as the price level falls, right, that would mean if this price level is falling, then, I'm sorry, is increasing, sorry. If the price level is increasing, then the denominator would be getting larger, right, which would mean that the whole term would be getting smaller, correct? The denominator getting larger, which would mean that if people have less demand for real money balances, then their overall demand for all goods and services are going to fall, because they're not going to be demanding as much cash as they typically were. Because basically what we're saying is that relatively speaking, things are more expensive. So that's why we're way up here. Because if we're saying that things are more expensive, relatively speaking, people don't demand as much money, to hold as much money, and they don't spend as much. When price levels are lower, people spend more money. That's what we're saying right here for our aggregate demand curve. Price levels lower, people spend more money. Price levels higher, people don't spend as much money. So it's a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. I'll pause here long enough.
And just to recap, price levels as in like the average prices of like goods and services.
Exactly. Yep. So you can measure it with CPI.
Measures.
Yeah, you could use GDP deflator. Typically, this is done with GDP deflators because we're already looking at real GDP on our x-axis. Typically.
And, yeah.
But any measure of prices, CPI, PPI, GDP index, all those would be fine.
And why is like a quantitative use of like real GDP?
Yep, exactly. Yep.
So when price levels are low,
Then people demand more real money balances, meaning that they carry more cash around with them, and they spend more money because things are cheaper, relatively speaking.
and then the other way around when it's high.
Yep, when it's high, people don't hold as much cash, and they don't spend as much cash because they know things are more expensive, relatively speaking.
Okay.
But this is for everything in the economy, all goods and services. Now, this is where that clause I added for you, demand and real money balances, is important. Because now I can shift the aggregate demand curve if I change the money supply. Because remember, this is a function of M over P, right? Aggregate demand, going back, just because you're seeing this slide right now, just going back here. Amount of money supply over the price level, which is meant, again, when the price level is going up, that the whole term is going down, right? Quantity is lower. As the price level falls, right, the whole term gets larger. So now I'm way out here. But if I change the numerator, M, like it would be as if I increase the money supply, it shifts the AD curve to the right. So this is where this is not just a demand curve. This is different. It's unfortunate that it uses the same term, and you might mistakenly think of it like demand, but it's not demand. This is saying, again, my demand for all goods and services is a function of my demand for real money balances, meaning how much cash I keep in my pockets. We are saying that my demand for real money balances is a function of what the overall price level is, because that's part of the term, M over P. That's what real money balances are, M over P. If the price level goes up, then my real money balance goes down, right? Because I don't have that much purchasing power, right? If the price level is really high, I don't have that much purchasing power. But what this is saying is that the whole curve shifts if I just print more cash, right? Because now more cash is available, basically. This would be a way that a Keynesian would say that a central bank should print more money in a recession, right? Because it shifts aggregate demand. This is the stimulating effects of expansionary monetary policy. I'll repeat that again because that's what essentially the slide is saying. This is the stimulative effects of expansionary monetary policy. These are the stimulative effects. Stimulating the economy, boosting the economy through expansionary monetary policy. That's what it looks like. Stimulative effects of expansionary monetary policy. Stimulative effects of expansionary monetary policy. Which, now we need to combine this with supply. But I want you to take note that this supply curve is going to look different in the short run than it does in the long run. In the long run, everything is fixed. In terms of capital stock and labor stock, not in terms of price, but everything is fixed in terms of how much capital you're gonna have and how many workers you're gonna have. Basically, this is just saying I'm at the extent of my production possibilities frontier, right? I'm at the edge of what I can produce. Okay, so if I'm fully employing everything, meaning everyone's working hard, then that means that, like I hit the constraint on my production possibilities frontier, I can only do so much in the long run aggregate supply. This is basically the long-term potential of the economy. In the long run, I am going to use 95% of my workers. 5% of my workers are going to be unemployed over the long run, right? And I don't know what the number is for capital, but let's say I'll use 90% of my capital. 10% of my capital will go unused for various reasons. Which means, and this is what's in the box, the important thing of this is that in the long run, price does not matter. Prices are completely flexible. And it also means that although you use fiscal policy and monetary policy to temporarily fix the economy, it has no impact on the long run economy. It has no impact on the long run economy. What that means is that I use expansionary and contractionary policy to get out of these humps and lumps, but it does nothing about the trend line. So you can't say, I'm going to permanently fix the economy as Congress or the president by investing in this. Because all it does in the long run is it keeps you at Y. But it does change the price level. Imagine me adding the vertical line here at this point. Expansionary monetary policy shifts it out. In the long run, I'm at the same Y, but I'm at what? Higher prices or lower prices?
Higher prices.
Exactly. So that's why you have to be incredibly careful if you're a policymaker, because your intervention automatically, unilaterally causes inflation. That's why you have to be incredibly careful as a policymaker not to overly stimulate the economy, because all you're doing is causing inflation. Sometimes it's better to do nothing at all. Because in the long run, you're actually not changing. You can't change the economy, because the only way to change this economy is by doing what? What's the only way I can change this vertical line? What's the only way I can change that vertical line?
Can they get more energy?
More energy, or more simply, more capital or more workers.
Oh yeah.
Right? Which would be all the things we just looked at in the previous chapter, right? The ways that capital can grow or labor stock can grow. But essentially, the only way I can do that is by changing these fundamental inputs. Otherwise, the economy is just fixed where it is. Can't change things. And so that's what you see right here then. Even though I was saying over here is that this is the consequence of expansionary monetary policy. Is that it does do, right, in the long run, the ultimate consequence of expansionary monetary policy is that the price level goes up, but the output stays the same. This is just articulating more formally what I just said orally. But if what I said to you makes sense in looking at this graph, then you're good to go so far. Did you have to work last night at the factory?
Yeah.
Were there trick-or-treaters there? Did you have to wear costumes?
We didn't have to wear costumes.
Could you?
I can only dress up like my face and my head because we were working with them.
I was the white rabbit from Alice in Wonderland.
Could you go as a factory worker? Like a cheesecake factory worker? I did that joke with my son yesterday because we went to the mall to do our trick-or-treating. And I was like, to Truman, I was like, look at all those policemen. Look at all those people who dressed as policemen, even though they were real policemen. He thought it was actually a pretty funny joke. Yeah. But then my wife asked me who I was going as. I was like, oh, a professor dad?
I'm going as a macro.
Yeah, I'm going as a macroeconomist.
Neoclassical Keynesian.
Yeah, I'm doing it in neoclassical Keynesian synthesis.
Oh,
No,
wow.
who would I go as? I don't know. Some of my favorite economists are people like Homer Jones. I like him. So maybe I could go as Homer Jones. He wore glasses like me. He's a little bit shorter than me, though. He's a little bit pudgier than me. So, I don't know. But even if I did all that, no one would say, hey, there's Homer Jones. No, the only famous person I could go as somewhat.
Wait, what does LRA stand for again?
Long run aggregate supply. Long run aggregate
And
supply.
then M just stands for like.
And what?
And then M just stands for like.
Money supply.
Yeah.
Money supply. Yep.
Oh, you dressed as exciting.
What? Well, I didn't dress as anything. The only person I think I could go as, which is what I went as one year, was this guy from the show White Collar. I went as him one year. I have about as much hair, and I wear glasses. I don't wear leather jackets or anything like that. I think he was also in that Sex and the City show. I think that was like one of the friends of one of the people.
Sex and the City.
Yeah, Sex and the City. Yeah.
That's pretty much what
Character.
Yeah, but I look like this guy, but this guy I think is a professional liar, so it's probably not a good person to be affiliated.
No,
Here.
no, he's a good guy. He's a good guy.
Okay, well, oh, he is? You watch the
you
show?
watch this show?
Yeah.
See,
Yeah.
you find out something new. Yeah, so I could go as this guy, but that's about it. Yeah, see.
He has like a personality disorder, so he's very like superstitious and stuff, and he has like
Suspicious.
he's like he's a conspiracy theorist too.
Yeah, okay, I can believe that stuff. Okay, yeah.
Smart. And like he helps the main character often.
Hmm.
He's a con artist too, but it's a show about con artists.
All right, that's the whole point of the show, yeah.
Yeah, but he's a good con artist, like he helps the police.
But see, if I dressed like that and I came into the factory, maybe you would know, but certainly Levi's not going to know. He's not going to say, hey, Mozzie. Yeah, I guess.
Oh, yeah.
So, exactly. So, I remember the best one, though.
I want to drink with Larry Padman.
There was this guy that went as Mayhem, from the Allstate commercials.
Yes.
Yeah, he dressed up as that. It was so cool. Like, he immediately, you could immediately tell. If I had the time, I would watch all 12 minutes of it. But, he's totally funny. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I'm gonna wreck your life.
man.
I'm gonna wreck your car. I'm gonna wreck your house.
Yeah, that guy is so.
You
Yeah,
can call me a homeless.
yeah. And I'm seeing that one where he's doing the phone like warm, warmer, cold, right? And then he gets in the accident. He's like hot, right? Because the phone slides up.
He
Okay.
jumps off a tree onto your car like as a
that's
cat.
right.
He's like, I'm a cat about to ruin your car.
Yeah,
Right
or he
now.
does the one where he's like a teenage girl, remember? And
Yeah.
he's like talking to his other friends. Okay, so what if now, instead of the long run aggregate supply curve, we have the short run aggregate supply curve? The way it's going to be different is that the prices are going to be stickier. Okay, so what that means then is that firms who are the suppliers, now they're going to be able to sell as much as they want as long as they're charging that price, which means that I'm not anymore subject to the capacity constraints in the economy. The idea is that I can temporarily go above my capacity constraints, right? Like we are right now, where we have 2% unemployment in Hawaii, even though it should be 5% in the long run. And we can do that because that means that we hire, people with like a drug conviction or a DUI or things like that. And we don't mind doing it because things are going so well. What that would mean, though, is that that short run aggregate supply curve, rather than being vertical, is instead going to be horizontal at that price level.
Can you explain what sticky means again? Like
Yep,
just
so
really brief.
sticky means that basically that for contractual reasons, for nuisance reasons, for habitual reasons, that the prices are stuck.
Okay.
Meaning, for instance, it used to be state law in Michigan that each thing had to have an individual price label on it. So you know how like when you go to Target, there's not a price item on each thing. It's just on the shelf, right? It says $1.99, and then all the items are there.
Yeah.
But in Michigan, it's state law that each item had to have a sticker on it that said 1.99. Which would mean that every time you want to change the price, you have to go in, rip off all the old price stickers, and put new ones on.
So no matter what, it's the same price.
So that would make those prices very sticky because think of the cost of changing the prices.
Yeah.
Whereas in today's economy, prices, for instance, at Target really aren't that sticky. Usually they have to agree to the price for a week, right? If like something's on sale, but after that week's done, then things go off of sale, right?
Yeah.
If we go on the web, right? I mean, it used to be if you bought something out of a catalog, usually the catalog would say these prices are good until March, right? But now with the web, right? I mean, prices change every day on Amazon, right? Sometimes by like a few pennies, but prices do change. So to the extent that things do not change, that's our stickiness. Which means that for this, right, there's our fixed amount, right? A fixed price level. Again, the governor is going to pay me what he's going to pay me for the next 4 years. I already know exactly what he's going to pay. And he knows exactly what he's going to pay all of my union members, right, for the next 3 years at this point, the next 3 years, because he knows exactly how many professors he has, and he knows exactly what he's paying them, and he knows exactly what the price is going to increase for the next 3 years. So it's going up, but it's at an already known rate. So prices basically are not changing at all, which is hard then, because if there is a recession in that intervening time, you can't really adjust things. You can't change the quantity of workers, and you can't adjust how much he's paying them. The reason why that's important, why what I'm saying is important, is the governor doesn't care about nominal wages. Meaning he doesn't care, let's say I'm earning $50,000 a year. I'm not earning that, I'm just saying, let's say I'm earning $50,000 a year. He doesn't care that I'm getting $50,000. What he cares about is how much he's paying me in real terms. Meaning, let's say that the price level is 1.5. Then it would be 50,000 divided by 1.5. Because he cares about what my purchasing power is. If prices don't go up that much, but my nominal wage goes up faster, then my real wage unexpectedly goes up, which he doesn't want, because that means he's basically paying me more to do the same work. He doesn't want to have to do that. Which is why oftentimes in a union contract, I don't know why they do it like this in Hawaii, they probably shouldn't. My wage, my first 2 years I was hired here, went up by 4% a year. That's higher, that's almost double, and in fact was almost triple what the inflation rate was in Hawaii during that time period. That's pretty bad, because for the state at least, because that basically meant that my real wage kept going up for 3 years, right? Or at least 3 times faster than it should have. You don't want to be committed to that. And, you know, there's probably lots of union reasons why that's the case, but again, you do want some flexibility over a time period. And obviously in the very short, so how short the short run is all going to depend on what the economy looks like. Now, what that means is that in the short run, that same expansionary monetary policy does have a real impact. So basically, Keynes is not wrong, right, in the short run. Keynes isn't trying to grow the economy in 1932, 1933, when he writes Theory of Money and Capital. He's not trying to grow the economy for the next 30 years. He's not trying to talk about the trend line. He's talking about how do we get us out of a trough. Keynesian macroeconomics, as opposed to solo growth model is all about changing the trend line, right? You change the trend line for an economy by changing the solo growth model. That's not what Keynes does. Keynes is worried about, again, the fluctuations. And what you do here is you engage in expansionary monetary policy to boost the economy from Y1 to Y2. Everyone understand that difference. It's a pretty important difference. Solo growth model, change the trend line. Keynesian macro, understand the humps and these lumps. Is a hump and a lump the opposite? I don't know. Hump and a
I
lump
think they're the same.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. Anyway, a down point and an up point.
Can you say that one more time?
Sure. So in the solo growth model, the previous chapter, that was all about changing the trend line. 4% make it 6%, or 4% becomes 2%. And we saw how that changes. Changes by changing the capital stock, capital per worker. That's what the solo growth model is. The one that we've been developing, economists have been developing over the past 20 to 30 years.
And
then Keynesian is all about how to get us out of the bottom point of a business cycle, or how to expand how long we're at the top point of a business cycle. Meaning that for Keynes, he's all talking about the short run and differentiating it at least from the long run, which means that the only reason why he can say it is good that the federal government spend more money or that the Federal Reserve expands the money supply is by having a short run aggregate supply curve, short run aggregate supply, and pushing the aggregate demand curve to stimulate the economy.
So solo is long run and Keynesian is short run.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. So essentially, what the solo growth model would be is the solo growth model would be all about growing the economy over the long run by shifting the Y bar.
Right.
And you shift the Y bar by having more capital
And
or better
maybe
workers.
getting a golden state whatever, and then
Yep, exactly. Yep.
this is talking about
And this is all talking about using your existing economy as it is and basically just, boosting the economy temporarily, right? Like, giving it a shot of adrenaline, right? If you have an allergic reaction, getting the, getting the what is it that they put in here? The EpiPen, right? And using, getting the EpiPen, right? That doesn't mean you don't have to go to the doctor, right? You have to go to the doctor after. The EpiPen's just allowing you to survive right to the next day, which means it gets us out of the trough and moves us out of it. But it doesn't fundamentally change the economy. Because, right, going back to this, all that it does, right, this monetary policy does not fundamentally alter the economy. You cannot make an economy grow permanently more with monetary or fiscal policy.
really influence it.
You can only do it with the solo growth model and by changing the amount of capital in, right? And in fact, right, again, all we saw here was that the consequence is inflation, permanently higher prices.
And more questions.
Yep.
Our price level. What is that expressed in? Is that a dollar amount or is that a
No, it's
percentage?
going to be, most of the time, it's going to be an index number. That's why I was saying like the 1.5. So again, like an index number, in the base year, it's typically 1 or 100, however, whichever number you want to use. And then in, let's say we have inflation, so then it goes from like 100 to 102.5, which would be a 2.5% increase. So this is typically represented as an index number,
I see.
like CPI, like GDP deflator.
So P could be, the change in P could be inflation.
It is inflation.
It is
Going from A to C is inflation. Yep.
So changing P is inflation.
So,
I can visually see inflation.
yep, exactly.
I can see that earlier.
So so this is an important slide because this now helps us understand the overall economy. So let's say we start off at point A. At point A, everything is actually really good. You probably shouldn't have gotten involved in the economy if you were at point A, unless you're trying to get elected. because there's never such a thing as too strong of an economy. So, right, so then you say, let's boost the economy and make everyone really happy about how things are, right? So I get reelected. So I stimulate the economy, meaning I shift from AD1 to AD2. In this example here, they're using expansionary monetary policy, meaning that delta M is greater than 0. But even if this was an expansionary monetary policy, you could just as easily make it expansionary fiscal policy. Just, fiscal policy being the government spending more money. So that shifts us from A to B, Y bar to Y2. Now, at Y bar, we were at 5% unemployment. At Y bar, we were at 5% unemployment, the natural rate of unemployment. I have now artificially stimulated the economy to be producing more, so meaning at Y2, and unemployment is then what, lower or higher? At Y2.
Lower.
Exactly. Because more stuff is being done, open law. Kind of like what our economy is today, right? So basically what economists are theorizing happened between 2010 and today is that we were below Y bar, right? Because we were in a recession. And we basically overstimulated the economy and went from something way down here and just overshot it. Because we didn't know any better.
After the recession.
Yeah, so in the recession, we were below AD1. Right, because then the output level would have been below potential. And that basically we overstimulated the economy. That's what most, at least when I was at the Fed, what is that now, 2 weeks ago? That's the reigning theory of what we think happened, is that we overstimulated the economy. So things initially seem really great at B, like how we feel today about today's economy, because the price level is still at P bar, which means, right, as I said a few weeks ago, right, inflation is really low, and we don't have a good understanding of why it's so low. We keep thinking it should be higher, but it hasn't increased. That's the quandary, that's the mystery of what economists are working through right now. Maybe, and this is the reigning theory, at least among leading Federal Reserve officials right now, well, as of 2 weeks ago, is that maybe prices and wages are stickier longer than they used to be, like 20 or 30 years ago. We're not entirely sure why, but that's at least one, that would be reasonable to think, that maybe things are just stickier longer. For instance, why does every cell phone plan seem to cost $50 a month, right? Or these all seem to cost like $50 or $60, dollars a month per line. Maybe it's like that because there's just so much competition, right? Or why do cars seem to cost $20,000 or $25,000, right? Maybe it's in the competition that exists that makes it that way. I don't know. But eventually, you move from B to C. And in the movement from B to C, which is happening over time, which is why there's multiple arrows here, what's happening is the economy is getting smaller, cooling down, meaning unemployment's going up, and prices are going up. In the movement from B to C, which happens in iterations over time, moving from A to B happens over about a 9-month period. But going from B to C happens over a 2 to 3 year time period. A to B happens over 9 months, certainly less than a year. But B to C happens over multiple years. And the economy then cools off. What the Federal Reserve is doing right now, going from B to C is painful. It's just painful because people are going to lose their jobs slowly, drip, drip, drip over time as prices are going up over time. What would seem to be an easier thing to do? If you were working for the Federal Reserve, what would it seem like it's easier to do? Which is what they're doing right now, at least for the US Federal Reserve.
The first one.
Exactly. Absolutely correct. Decrease the money supply. Go from 82 to 81. Which is the very first time that we are trying to do this. This is the first time in modern macroeconomic events, history, that the Federal Reserve is trying to go from B back to A. We've never done it before. We have no idea how to do it. And we are attempting for the first time to go from B back to A. It's really hard to do. You're basically forcing an economy to cool down. It almost never happens. Well, it never happens. I shouldn't say almost never. It never has happened. And we've tried to do it before, and it's always failed. Because usually what happens is that we either do nothing and the economy slowly goes from B to C, or we go 82 to 81 and then overcorrect and go from B to like D, right, way over here, overcool it basically. We've never been able to go from B to A, ever.
Wow.
So,
No one's ever successfully used contractionary monetary policy.
We've tried, I mean, it's been tried, I mean, because you can look at this chart and see that it's pretty obvious. I mean, certainly on Levi's standards of what we need to do, right? That, right? All you need to do is go from B to A, right? That doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that part out. But the question is, how much do I need of a delta M? How much do I need to change money supply precisely to go from B to A? We've never gotten that correct. Almost every time we've overshot it and gone from 82 to 80, some point to the left of 81. But that's even the few times we've actually successfully done it. You can look at what Jerome Powell, Jerry Powell is facing right now in terms of Trump being really grumpy with him and all the pressure he faces. He's just trying to do 82 to 81, and he's getting like a shitstorm at him for trying to do the right thing, right? And if he's at all cautious or feel like his political, right? Because, I mean, even a Federal Reserve official is a politician on some level. If Jerry Powell thinks he's only going to get, or Janet Yellen, the previous Federal Reserve chairwoman, did not get reappointed because she was trying to go from B to A. So she basically got fired, which would mean that Jerry Powell essentially knows that if he's trying to go from B to A, he's going to get fired as well.
Midterm? Is he elected or is it?
He's nominated by the president and then approved by the Senate.
But then once he's approved, they can come out anytime?
No, the president does not have although the current president thinks that he has the ability to remove Powell, he doesn't. I mean, you really cannot fire Powell. Powell doesn't, he has a term. So unless he murders someone or something really bad, he can't get kicked out of his office. But what would happen is that he will not be renominated if he does what he's doing. So either Powell will be a chicken shit and stay at point B. Doesn't seem like he's going to do that. More likely than not, Powell's going to screw up and he's going to overshoot A. I mean, we'll just go from an inflationary gap to a recessionary gap. So we're just going to go from this point, and then we're going to wake up someday a year from now, and we're going to be in a recession because he cooled the economy down too much. He didn't do it on purpose. It's just that at this point, what you're seeing right now are the limits of what we know about the economy. We're living in the world's largest economy. We think we know what to do, but we really don't know what to do. And we approximately know what to do. But think about it. Other things can intervene. So let's say I engage in contractionary policy, and then all of a sudden, Saudi Arabia, right, which is facing this whole thing with killing that one national right in Turkey and all this kind of international upheaval. Yeah. Let's say that every country gets really pissed. It's not going to happen, but what if every country said, dude, you did a really bad thing. We're no longer going to buy your oil. It's going to wreck the oil markets. And it's going to, if we're already engaged in contractionary policy, and then all of a sudden oil prices shoot up, and that also cools the economy, that was completely unanticipated, And now we cooled it down just enough to go from B to A, but then this whole oil thing happened, and now we overshot it.
So that
It's not gonna. I mean, something's gonna happen where the shit's gonna hit the fan, and it's gonna go from B to something less than A. So I'm not trying to be a pessimist here, but it's the reality of the way that
makes sense.
which is exactly what this is, which is a shock. Meaning, as a shock, something unexpected happened. Like my oil price example. Like, basically, in the lead up to the Great Recession of 2007, people think that the Federal Reserve just did nothing. And I'm not trying to defend the organization. Well, I am defending it. I was self-conscious about it, but I wasn't with them. I was with the Philly Fed at the time, so it wasn't my fault. People think that the Federal Reserve wasn't doing what it was supposed to do. But if you look at the federal funds rate, in 2005, the federal funds rate was almost 6%, meaning interest rates were pushed up incredibly high in 2005, which is before the housing crisis happened. The shock was, right? So efforts were being made to go from B to A, right? If we look at that previous picture, right? Efforts were being made as early as 2004, 2005 to go from B to A. But in 2007, right, just as they're shifting the economy back, all of a sudden, the capital markets collapse because people were being made loans that shouldn't have been getting loans, right? Like The Big Short, basically, right? The movie of The Big Short, which meant that the capital markets collapsed, which is essentially a shock to the system. And in this case, it's a shock to the demand curve because it means that most people, when they're buying things, rely on the credit markets to buy things, right? Some people do buy their car without a loan, but most people do not. Some people buy their home without a loan, but most people do not. You are all paying for an education. Most of you are not paying it all at once. You are getting a loan. So, right, think of the collapse in aggregate demand that occurs when all of a sudden people no longer have access to the credit markets like they used to. That means that the economy collapses, which is what you see here. Imagine my original picture here where we were overstimulated, we cooled the economy down, and then all of a sudden a shock happened, which meant us go from A and B. So now, instead of an inflationary gap, let me just go back here just so you understand the terms I'm using here. This is what's called an inflationary gap. It's called an inflationary gap because the gap is different than Y bar. But it's called an inflationary gap because if I do nothing, it causes inflation.
I see. Yeah.
So it's called an inflationary gap.
Because P is rising.
Exactly, because P is rising.
P is rising.
So the Federal Reserve tries to eliminate the inflationary gap by cooling the economy down, which is what we're trying to do now. Even though we don't see inflation, we know that inflation is going to happen at some point.
So that's what you mean by B to A.
Exactly, B to A. So we're trying to cool the economy down so that we don't see the inflation that we know is going to happen. What I'm saying is, this is harder than medical science because unexpected things happen, like these shocks, which totally fuck with our model here. This is an example of a recessionary gap. It's called a recessionary gap because Y2 is less than Y bar. Y2 is less than Y bar. As you can see here, in a recessionary gap, the economy does fix itself. B to C, I mean, see what happens there, right? Is that when there's fewer people working, wages are driven downwards. And very slowly, people start hiring these cheaper and cheaper workers, right? But there's a pain that's associated with this recessionary gap. That pain is that you've got all these people unemployed. So, right, as soon as, right, I don't know, let's say 3 years from now when we're in our next recession, or 2 years from now, or a year from now, politicians aren't gonna let Jerry Powell do what he wants to do, which might just say, just wait for it to go to B to C. It's not that bad of a recession. The complaint that I've made, if you've had me for other classes, the complaint I've made always against Alan Greenspan is that he always overreacted to points that were B. So the dot-com bubble in 2001, he reacted to that small recession, 6-month recession, less than that, by overstimulating the economy, meaning, oh my God, we're at B, I got to really bump out of that, right? And that's what led to, right, just like the 98 almost recession, in the 1990 recession, he always overreacted to recessions, which meant that people loved him because we almost never were at a point B for very long, right? That's why, well, at least 15 years ago, he was called the Great Maestro, which meant, oh my God, dude, he always gets us out of point B really fast. We're never stuck at the painful movement from B to C. No one today thinks Greenspan was as great as he was 15 years ago, because now we, in hindsight, can really see that all that he did is just put a bandage on a really bad wound, right? Like if I stab you in the stomach, put one of those really big band-aids over it, it's not going to look like I really hurt him that much, right? Until the blood's oozing out of the glass pad, right? But if I were to lift open that thing, it probably would have been better to, like, I don't know, right? Just kind of take him to the hospital, right? And let it get stitched up. And it's going to be painful for a while, but it's better in the long run, right? So the critique that's often made against the Federal Reserve is, can a Federal Reserve chairman, in this case Jerry Powell, resist the political temptation to push us out of B? He should. I don't know if he'll be able to. And most Federal Reserve chairmen have been unable to do that. The only example we have of someone not doing that is Paul Volcker in the early 80s, where he intentionally caused unemployment to cool the economy down. And Ronald Reagan probably would have fired him if he could have, but he couldn't. But as soon as Reagan could get rid of him, he did, and replaced him with Greenspan, who did exactly what Reagan wanted him to do, which was stimulate the economy. Which is why the 1980 recession was so bad. It was intentionally bad because he was trying to cool the economy down. The way into here is that, yes, over time, the economy does slowly get better. It's just that that's not politically palatable, meaning politicians aren't going to wait for that. The Federal Reserve Chairman faces an incredible amount of pressure to push the economy out of this problem. I'll wait.
So deflation.
Yeah, so there's deflation, exactly, which is what happened in 2010. Because again, as I said, point B is really what we were at in 2008, 2009, 2010. And right, so as I said before, 2004, 2005, we were already starting to contract the economy. Then the credit market collapses, that's our shock, pushed us all the way to B. And then from 2008 to 2010, prices slowly fell and wages slowly fell, reflecting the fact that there was lots of unemployment, right? So workers here in the UH system all had to take a forced holiday. I was with the University of Wisconsin. We all had to take a forced holiday, which is a way of reducing our prices while honoring the union contract, right? Which said, it basically just said, yeah, you're guaranteed to get, let's say, $50,000 a year, but you worked 1 week less than you should have. So we had to reduce your pay by 2% because, right, a week is right about 2% of the year. But everyone was forced to take that kind of holiday vacation.
Like a loophole.
Exactly. So prices and wages did fall in 2008 to 2010, just like prices fell in 1937 during the Great Depression.
So after we get to C,
Yep.
does the long run and the short run aggregate supplies rearrange themselves as a new point A at C?
No, we just stay at C. So C is actually better than A. So C and A represent the same Y bar, but C is better than A because C, the price levels are lower.
Okay. But then the new, so like the new cross pretty much would be centered at C.
Correct. Yep.
As well as right now.
Yep, so SRAS is always moving down and following the points of equilibrium. So let's say I added a point D right here, then the blue bar would come down to where D is. E, F, G, H, C, right? That kind of thing. But it happens only over the long run, which means that you could have a recession that lasts years and years and years, which is why, going back to the beginning of this lecture, when we looked, not the beginning of, well, the beginning of this topic, why were recessions so long in the 1800s? Because the Federal Reserve Bank didn't even exist. So when we hit a recession, the reason why a recession was so long was because we didn't even know how to like push the economy out of a recession. So you always waited to go to see. That was the only thing you knew how to do, right? So you do well, then some shock would happen, move us out of the, right, move us out of a good situation, and we just keep, right, moving down, and slowly fixing ourselves. Now it's, can't have a multi-year recession. These would be other issues, would be our supply shocks. People sometimes say that, like, for instance, the Affordable Care Act would be a supply curve shock. Unions, or getting rid of unions would be supply shocks. I mean, the Trump administration is all about shocking the system, but in a good way. So in that case, it would be, if we get rid of environmental regulations, that's a positive supply shock. If we get rid of the Affordable Care Act and say everyone cannot collectively bargain, that would be a positive supply shock. So the reason why we're seeing the economy we're seeing today, because of Trump, would be because he's engaged in encouraging favorable supply shocks. Quite simply. I mean, that only you can only do that so long. So the question that Trump would have to answer, and I'm not picking on the guy, but I'm saying, if we want to be thoughtful about this, the question would be, is what do you do 2 years from now? You already reduced environmental regulations, you already kind of altered the Affordable Care Act. What do you do 2 years from now, right? So how do you, what kind of favorable supply shock can you do 2 years from now? I'm not exactly sure what that would be.
Now, what's the question?
Well, I think if you were an economist thinking about what the Trump administration, how you would understand why the economy has done so well since Trump was elected, would be that he's been engaged in policies that have been favorable supply shocks. Getting rid of environmental regulations, saying that employees don't have a right to collectively bargain, reconstructing the Affordable Care Act. And if he's already done that, and that's what boosted the economy right now that we're seeing today, the question is what does he do 2 years from now when he's up for re-election? Again, I don't care on the vote, but I think it would be reasonable to say, well, what do you do now? You've already done the things already that boosted the economy temporarily, because that's what a shock does. Temporarily boosted the economy. If he doesn't change anything, it's just going to go back to Y bar, right? Except with higher prices. I don't know what he would do, years from now. So what that means is that really we need to make efforts then to do things that we need to focus more on stabilizing the economy rather than fixing the economy temporarily. We need to not give Ian the Band-Aid, we need to drive him to the hospital, right? Which is essentially what this is saying, right? That we need to only react to supply shocks that we think are significant enough and long enough to fix them. So if Saudi Arabia we no longer buy our oil from them, we need to do something to stimulate the economy from what's going to be higher oil prices. Or what we should have done in 2010 would have been because of this like fracking, right, horizontal drilling for oil, we should have known that that was going to reduce oil prices to less than $50 a barrel, and we should have tried to cool the economy down. But how are you going to advocate for cooling the economy down in just after finishing a really bad recession? I mean, it can be hard to do that. This is politically hard to do, stabilize things. But you should. You should do it, but it's hard to do it.
So this isn't like trying to do it at one job, right?
No, this would be China. I'm just trying to translate. But this is more, for instance, what China would be worried about right now is how much the tariffs have affected their export markets. The tariff policies of Trump are a supply shock. They were not anticipated, and they are reducing the ability of firms to sell their goods abroad, or at least in the United States. It was unexpected, it was unanticipated, which means that the Central Bank of China, the CBC, needs to engage in expansionary monetary policy to stimulate the economy out of what's been destroying the economy for the past year. As an example of this, I only have a few more slides here, but I know I've only a few more minutes, but this is a good lecture today, so I'm gonna build on this good lecture for today.
That's good.
It's a good day today. I'm not gonna lie to you, it's a good day today. So I'm just gonna look in the Wall Street Journal here, and this is always the way I do it. If you go on the Wall Street Journal, you could have a subscription like myself and be a total nerd. But probably an easier way to do it would just be don't get the subscription, because you can always look at markets without a subscription. Just go to the markets part of this. And I want to look at how China's market is the worst performing. Look at it for the past year. It's down, I think, about 40%, if I'm not mistaken. And this is just telling me what's happened today. Can I break that out? No. Maybe I can. Hang with me here. We're not talking about this very much because obviously we don't live in China, so we're not as concerned about it. But obviously, when you look at it this way, that would mean that we've gone from, at the beginning of this year, 33.48 to 26.37, and that's with the Central Bank of China stimulating the economy. You basically, as these kind of things point out here, is that basically we do need to stimulate the economy in China a little bit further. And this is a classic way that you're seeing the supply shock. Most of the tariffs have been this year, and it's obviously slowing the economy down. So if you work at the Central Bank of China, you're obviously thinking we need to do some expansionary policy here. You know, what's cool about this though too is, like Fred, you can create some pretty cool charts over time with this.
What's Trump's goal to like put it into try to cool or?
Well, his goal that'd be cool if it was. No, his goal, I mean, obviously I'm not the guy, so it's hard for me to say, but
We'll just
I mean, my theory is that it becomes your whole others are bad, we are good, right? Which would be, we don't want cheap Chinese stuff. We want American workers doing American jobs, which makes us great. right? I mean, that's kind of a simple way of thinking about it. But I don't think it's that inaccurate because if you're not deep in Keynesian macro theory or a solo growth model, it's easy just to say, let's kick dirt in his eyes and punish him for being other. And then, but it actually hurts all of us. I mean, as we saw with the solo growth model, it does hurt us all economically in the long run. It might make us feel good in the short run, but it is going to hurt. It does hurt a country in the long run. I'm not saying, for instance, immigration. Most economists are in favor of immigration because it means N is growing. And you want N to grow if we're not replicating fast enough. And it turns out that although in Hawaii I am a minority, I am a majority on the mainland. And it turns out that my race, Caucasians, are not replicating fast enough, which means that we need to allow people to come in from other countries, right? And like to replace my insufficient replication. It turns out that people aren't having enough kids. I've now got 2, so I'm raising the average, but there's enough people that are having 1 or 0 that are hurting the averages. So, yeah. So this would be what we're trying to do here, is that if a supply shock happens, and I started out here and I got moved down to AV1, I should immediately take steps to, or in this case, if I went from A to B here, because it shifted my supply curve in the short run, because it's a supply curve shock. So this would be saying, what this is a graph of is, when Obama took office, the first thing he did, and really the only thing he cared about, was the Affordable Care Act. People said to him he should have engaged in the climate control things. He didn't. He used up all of his political capital for the Affordable Care Act, which then, right, after that, he then tried to do climate change, right? But he kind of ran out of time, right? That was the end of the 8-year time period, which meant then it fell in Trump's lap. And then obviously he didn't sign that and they removed it. Again, I don't care what your politics are. I'm just trying to think of it like an economist. But the passage of the Affordable Care Act raised prices for all businesses. A to B, right? That's a supply curve shock, a negative supply shock. A business that could get away with not giving workers health care now had to give them health care. So the economy moved, you could say, from A to B, which meant that the 2008 financial crisis was actually worsened by the passage of the Affordable Care Act. I don't think it's too hard to say that. Basically, Obama got around this by delaying the implementation. Most of the Affordable Care Act wasn't fully implemented until 2011, 2012, 2013, after the recession had basically ended. I'll pause here for a moment.
So short run.
So in the short run, basically this supply shock moves the economy from full employment, which it is at point A, to a recessionary gap, which is what it is at point B. So the supply shock happens and it pushes us to a recession. So Trump is not wrong. Trump is not wrong when he says that the Affordable Care Act is slowing the economy down, or when he says environmental regulations hurt the economy. He's not wrong. Everything's a trade-off, right? We have to accept, are we comfortable with slower growth for a cleaner environment? And if you don't believe that that's the case, that's fine, that's your choice. But you're basically then saying B is not a palatable point. I cannot live in a world that looks like B. And I'm willing to live with dirtier air and water to avoid point B. That's fine. I mean, I'm not, you get to decide what you would decide. But if that happens on the federal government side, the fiscal side, what we're saying here is that monetary authorities can then make steps to get us from B to C, to basically fix, to stabilize a supply shock that's happened to the economy. Which is actually okay. Because if I had done nothing, I would have gone from A to B, and then I slowly would have gone back from B to A. If I had not done anything, I would have gone from A to B, and then slowly moved back to A. Just to reiterate, why do I go from B to A? I go from B to A because at B, there's unemployed workers, and those unemployed workers drive down wages and prices. And as wages go cheaper, firms hire more workers. And I slowly move from B to A. But I might not be willing to live in an economy that looks like the movement from B to A, so I just temporarily juice the economy to go from B to C. I have to accept that prices are now going to be permanently higher, which they are. C and A have the same output level, but C has permanently higher prices than I used to have.
Inflation.
Yep, so C has permanently higher inflation. But like all the things I've been talking about, I have to be willing to accept that trade-off. Am I willing to accept now having unemployment not be as bad as it could have been if I just waited for B to A? Am I willing to accept slightly higher prices for not as long of a recession? And if you're willing to make that trade-off, then you're all good. And that's all basically economists, macroeconomists think about: how do you stabilize the economy? Again, the issue is for economists would be, are you smart enough economists to know that we're at A or B or C? Because in the current moment, hard to know where you are, right? I mean, it's only over time or in retrospect that you know where you were at. Otherwise, I'd be very rich, and I wouldn't be doing this job, right? If I knew where we were, A, B, or C.
So how great is a world where we're at a perfectly stable economy?
It's usually very fleeting, and they are only very short moments in time where you're at A or C. Something's almost always fucking it up. Either accidentally because of a supply shock. I mean, think about Independence Day, the movie, right? What if all of a sudden aliens came down and started doing all their junk to us, right? I mean, that would be a supply curve shock and a demand side shock. But things are always happening. But then also, too, the Federal Reserve officials are, in some sense, politicians. And so they could fuck it up as well for career reasons, right? It furthers their career to do something. Okay, let's end it there. Great work today. We worked hard today. We did work hard today.
I think this was the most interesting chapter.
Good. That's what I love to hear.